December 23rd, 1818. The pale afternoon light filtered through the frosted windows of Wyndham House as Aurelia carefully adjusted the small velvet collar around Quill's neck. The tiny terrier sat patiently on her lap, his dark eyes watching her face with the unwavering devotion that had become both her greatest comfort and her deepest curse. The collar was festive enough, deep green with tiny silver bells, though it mattered little what either of them wore to the Christmas Eve ball at Ashworth Manor tomorrow evening. At 24, Lady Aurelia Wyndham had long since accepted her role in such gatherings, not as a participant in the glittering dance of courtship, but as a curiosity, relegated to the settees near the servants' entrance, clutching her puppy while the other young ladies waltzed past in clouds of silk and whispered pity. Her fingers traced the soft fur behind Quill's ears, the gesture that always calmed him when she sensed the telltale tremor beginning in his small body. And she felt the familiar ache that accompanied every thought of what her devotion had cost her. The bond she shared with this fragile creature, forged in the terrifying night 2 years past when his first seizure had nearly taken him from her, had also left her with something far more damaging in the eyes of society. An obsession that rendered her unmarriageable to every eligible gentleman who entered a ballroom. My beautiful family. Before we dive into Aurelia and her puppy story, I need to share something important with you. We're on a mission to reach 1,000 subscribers, and right now, there are only limited spots to be among our founding 1,000. Our inner circle who were here from the beginning. And I want you to be among our most cherished first 1,000. These first 1,000 subscribers will always hold a special place in this community. You'll be the ones who believed in these stories when we were just starting out. The ones who helped build something beautiful. But here's the thing. Once we hit that milestone, that opportunity closes forever. You'll still be welcome, but you won't be part of that exclusive founding group who shaped this channel's journey. So if you've been watching without subscribing, now is your moment. Don't let this story end without you being part of our family. Click that subscribe button. Let's reach this milestone together, and tell me where you are watching from. Now, let's begin with Aurelia's story. Aurelia reached for the small leather satchel she had prepared the night before, checking its contents with the practiced efficiency of a field surgeon preparing for battle. Clean linens, should he have an accident. A vial of the tincture Dr. Wyndham had prescribed, though it did little more than ease the tremors after they had already begun. A small flask of water and the special biscuits he could tolerate even when his stomach was unsettled. And tucked in the innermost pocket, wrapped in soft chamois, the detailed instructions she had written in her own hand, describing exactly what must be done should the worst happen while she was somehow separated from him. The very thought made her throat tighten. She had been separated from him only twice since that first terrible episode. Once when her aunt had convinced her to attend a garden party while Quill recovered from a particularly severe spell, and once when her brother had physically barred her from her own room, insisting she needed rest more than the dog needed her vigil. Both times, she had felt as though she were drowning, her lungs unable to draw proper breath until she could see him again, could place her hand against his small rib cage and feel the steady rhythm of his heartbeat beneath her palm. "I know what they say about me," she whispered to Quill, fastening the final buckle on his traveling basket, lined with her own shawl to keep him warm during the carriage ride. "That I've grown peculiar. That I've chosen you over any hope of a normal life." His tail wagged once, twice, and she felt the treacherous burning behind her eyes that she had promised herself she would not indulge. Not tonight. Not when she needed to be strong. The door opened softly, and her mother entered, all quiet concern and carefully pressed lavender silk, her face already composed in that expression Aurelia had come to know so well. The look of a woman preparing to fight a battle she had already lost a dozen times before. dearest," she began, crossing the room to stand beside her daughter's chair. "I've just spoken with Lady Ashworth's secretary. The Duke has specifically requested that all guests observe the strictest formality tomorrow evening. It is to be a very grand affair, with some quite important personages in attendance." She paused, her hand coming to rest on Aurelia's shoulder. Perhaps it would be wise to leave Quill at home this once. The Harrisons' housekeeper is perfectly capable of watching him for a few hours, and you know how fond of him she has become." "No, Mama." Aurelia kept her voice gentle, though her hand instinctively tightened around Quill's small body. "You know I cannot. But, darling, you must see how it appears. I see exactly how it appears." Aurelia looked up at her mother, and for the first time in their many variations of this conversation, she allowed the full weight of her pain to show in her eyes. "I see it in every pitying glance, every whispered comment about poor Lady Aurelia and her little dog. I see it in the way gentlemen who once asked me to dance now cannot meet my gaze. I am not blind to what my choice has cost me, Mama." Her mother's face crumpled slightly, her own eyes growing bright. "Then why?" "Because he needs me." The words came out fiercer than Aurelia intended, and she softened her tone with effort. "Because when he collapsed at the Pemberton Musicale, not one person in that entire glittering assembly knew what to do. They stood there, staring, while he suffered. Mrs. Harrison is kind, Mama. Truly she is. But she does not know the signs. She does not know that he paws at his left ear exactly 7 minutes before the tremors begin, or that he must be held in a very specific way to keep him from injuring himself, or that the seconds immediately after are the most dangerous, when his heart—" Her voice broke, and she pressed her face against Quill's soft fur, breathing in the familiar scent of him. "Oh, my darling girl." Her mother sank onto the settee beside her, and for a long moment, neither of them spoke. The room had grown darker, the winter afternoon fading into the deep blue of early evening, and somewhere in the house below, Aurelia could hear the servants preparing dinner, the ordinary sounds of a life that felt increasingly distant from her own. "You are sacrificing your future," her mother said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "Do you understand that? Every ball you attend with that dog, every invitation you accept only to spend the evening in some forgotten corner. You are writing yourself out of the very world you were born into." "I know." Aurelia lifted her head, gently placing Quill in his basket, where he curled immediately into a small, perfect circle. "But Mama, what is the alternative? That I abandon him to the care of strangers and smile and dance while wondering if he is crying for me? That I choose a future built on the foundation of broken faith?" She shook her head. "I cannot be that person. I will not." Her mother stood slowly, her silk skirts rustling in the quiet room, and for a moment, Aurelia thought she might press the argument further. Instead, she leaned down and pressed a kiss to her daughter's forehead, her lips cool and dry against Aurelia's skin. "Then I suppose we shall face tomorrow's whispers together," she said softly, "as we have faced all the others." When the door closed behind her, Aurelia sat alone in the gathering darkness, her hand resting on the edge of Quill's basket, and allowed herself one moment of desperate, foolish longing for a world where love and loyalty were not measured against social acceptability, where the truest parts of her heart would not condemn her to a lifetime of margins and shadows. Then she dried her eyes, straightened her shoulders, and began to prepare for the Christmas Eve ball at Ashworth Manor, where the eccentric Duke Edmund Shaw would be watching, and where her fate though she could not yet know it, would turn on the very devotion that had made her a pariah. The carriage lurched to a halt before the grand entrance of Ashworth Manor, and Aurelia felt Quill shift in his basket beside her, his small body pressing against her gloved hand as though he could sense her reluctance to leave the safety of their enclosed space. Through the frosted window, she could see the blaze of candlelight spilling from every window of the Duke's residence, could hear the faint strains of a string quartet tuning their instruments, and the brittle laughter of guests already arrived and eager to be seen. "Courage, my dear," her mother murmured, though whether she spoke to her daughter or to herself, Aurelia could not say. The footman opened the door, and the winter air rushed in, sharp with cold and possibility. Aurelia gathered Quill's basket carefully, ensuring the small blanket remained tucked around him, and allowed herself to be handed down onto the torchlit drive. Already she could feel the weight of curious stares from the other guests making their way up the stone steps, could see the subtle turn of heads and the immediate whisper that followed her appearance. There she is, with that creature. How she dares show her face. She lifted her chin and walked forward, her emerald silk gown rustling against the snow-dusted steps, Quill's basket held close to her chest like a talisman against the judgment she knew awaited her inside. The ballroom at Ashworth Manor was everything the gossips had promised. A cathedral of Christmas splendor, with garlands of holly and ivy woven through every column, and a massive Yule log blazing in the great hearth at the far end of the room. Crystal chandeliers threw dancing light across the polished floor, where couples were already beginning to form sets for the first dance. And along the walls, the usual arrangement of society had already taken shape. The young and hopeful clustered near the orchestra, the matrons and chaperones occupying the gilt chairs nearest the refreshment tables, and the dowagers commanding the settees closest to the fire, where they could observe all and pass judgment accordingly. Aurelia knew precisely where she belonged in this hierarchy. Nowhere. She made her way along the perimeter of the room, nodding politely to the few acquaintances who acknowledged her presence, and found a small upholstered chair positioned in the alcove near the western windows, far enough from the dancing to avoid being trampled, close enough to the hearth that Quill would not catch a chill. She set his basket down carefully on the warming bricks at the edge of the fireplace, adjusting the blanket so he would be comfortable but not overheated, and permitted herself one small stroke along his soft ears before straightening and arranging her skirts. "There now," she whispered. "Safe and warm, just as I promised." "How touching," a voice like cut glass said from behind her. "The devoted nursemaid attends to her charge." Aurelia did not need to turn to identify the speaker. Lady Isabella Thorne's voice was unmistakable, all honeyed malice and practiced cruelty, perfected over 3 successful London seasons and a strategic marriage to Viscount Thorne, whose fortune had purchased her a title and whose convenient preference for his Scottish hunting lodge had left her free to reign over society unchallenged. "Lady Thorne," Aurelia said quietly, rising and turning to face her tormentor. "How lovely you look this evening." It was true, unfortunately. Isabella was resplendent in ruby silk that complemented her dark hair and pale skin, diamonds glittering at her throat and wrists, every inch of her designed to command attention and admiration. She stood now with 2 of her particular friends, Miss Caroline Hartwick and the newly married Mrs. Pemberton, both watching Aurelia with the eager cruelty of spectators at a bear baiting. "How kind of you to say," Isabella replied, her smile sharp as a blade. "Though I confess, I was quite surprised to see you here tonight. When I heard the Duke had specified the strictest formality, I naturally assumed that meant the guest list would be limited to persons of, shall we say, appropriate dignity." Her gaze dropped deliberately to Quill's basket. "Not every creature who might wander in from the stables?" Miss Hartwick tittered behind her fan, and Mrs. Pemberton's eyes widened with delighted scandal. "Quill is hardly a stable animal," Aurelia said, fighting to keep her voice steady. "He is a well-bred terrier, and he is your constant companion. Yes, we are all excruciatingly aware." Isabella took a step closer, and Aurelia could smell her perfume. Something heavy and oriental that seemed to fill the small alcove like smoke. "Tell me, Lady Aurelia, do you truly not see how utterly absurd you have become? You are 24, in possession of a respectable fortune and a not entirely unfortunate face. And yet you insist on parading about with that animal as though it were your infant child." She paused, letting her words settle like poison. "It is no wonder every eligible gentleman in 3 counties has learned to look straight through you." The words struck precisely where they were intended, and Aurelia felt heat rise to her cheeks even as she forced herself to remain still, to keep her expression composed. She would not give Isabella the satisfaction of visible pain. "My choices are my own concern, Lady Thorne. On the contrary, your choices have become everyone's concern, precisely because they are so spectacularly ill-judged." Isabella's voice had risen slightly, enough that several nearby guests had begun to turn their attention toward the alcove, scenting drama like hounds scenting blood. "You have made yourself a figure of ridicule, Lady Aurelia, an object of pity. And the truly tragic part is that you seem entirely unaware of it." "That is quite enough, Isabella," Mrs. Pemberton said, though her tone carried more excitement than reproach. "Is it?" Isabella's eyes glittered in the candlelight. "I think Lady Aurelia deserves honesty, since no one else seems willing to provide it. You are sacrificing any hope of a respectable future for a pet obsession. You sit in corners at balls, clutching that basket, while other young ladies dance and flirt and secure their positions in the world. And for what? So that you might nurse a dog who would be perfectly content in a kennel with a warm blanket?" Aurelia's hands had begun to tremble, and she clasped them tightly together, pressing them against her skirts. In his basket, Quill stirred slightly, perhaps sensing her distress, and the small movement caught Isabella's attention. "Good heavens, is it even awake? Or do you simply carry it about like some sort of peculiar accessory?" She laughed, a bright, terrible sound. "I confess, Lady Aurelia, I cannot decide whether you are the most devoted companion in England or simply the most pitiable spinster. Perhaps both." "Perhaps," Aurelia heard herself say, her voice emerging from somewhere distant and cold. "You might concern yourself with your own affairs, Lady Thorne, and allow me the dignity of managing mine." Isabella's smile widened, triumphant. "Dignity? My dear girl, you forfeited dignity the moment you chose a dog over a duke. Or have you not heard? His Grace himself is here tonight, recently returned from abroad, and rumored to be seeking a duchess." She leaned closer, her voice dropping to a stage whisper that carried perfectly to their growing audience. "Though I rather suspect his requirements will include a lady who can attend a ball without bringing her menagerie." With that, she swept away in a rustle of ruby silk, her companions following like remoras behind a shark, and Aurelia was left standing alone in her alcove, feeling the weight of dozens of eyes upon her, hearing the whispers that rippled outward through the glittering crowd like stones thrown into still water. She sank back into her chair, her legs suddenly unsteady, and reached down to rest her hand on Quill's basket, drawing what comfort she could from his warm, sleeping presence. The ball had barely begun, and already she felt flayed open, her most vulnerable parts exposed to the casual cruelty of people who could not possibly understand what they asked her to sacrifice. Through the crowd, somewhere near the entrance to the ballroom, she heard a stir of activity, the particular quality of attention that meant someone important had arrived. The Duke of Ashworth, no doubt, come to survey his glittering assembly and select his future duchess from among the eager, perfect young ladies who had not, as Isabella so delicately put it, brought their menagerie. Aurelia closed her eyes briefly, willing herself not to cry, and settled in for the long, lonely evening ahead. The first waltz had ended, and the dancers were dispersing across the ballroom floor in swirls of silk and superfine wool, when Aurelia noticed the gentleman approaching her alcove. He was tall and solidly built, with thinning sandy hair and the ruddy complexion of a man who spent considerable time outdoors. She recognized him vaguely from some prior assembly. Baron Whitmore, perhaps? Or was it Whitfield? A widower of comfortable fortune who owned an estate somewhere in Derbyshire and had been, according to her mother's hopeful whispers, seeking a sensible wife to help manage his household and 4 half-grown children. He navigated the perimeter of the ballroom with the determined gait of a man on a mission. And Aurelia felt her stomach tighten with the familiar dread of forced conversation. She straightened in her chair, arranging her features into a polite mask of welcome, even as her hand drifted instinctively to rest on the edge of Quill's basket. "Lady Aurelia," the Baron said, executing a passable bow. "I hope you will forgive the intrusion. Baron Whitmore of Whitmore Hall. I believe we were introduced at the Sutherland Musicale last spring." "Of course, Baron Whitmore. How pleasant to see you again." The lie came easily, smoothed by years of similar exchanges. "I confess, I had hoped to find you less occupied this evening." His gaze flickered briefly to the basket at her feet, then returned to her face with obvious effort. "That is to say, I wondered if you might honor me with the next dance. I believe it is to be a country set, quite lively." Aurelia's practiced smile remained fixed in place, even as her heart sank. "How kind of you to ask, Baron. However, I fear I must decline. I am not dancing this evening." "Ah." He shifted his weight, clearly unprepared for refusal. "Perhaps later in the evening, then? Or I would be more than happy to fetch you some refreshment, if you find yourself in need of—" "Thank you, but no." She softened her tone, recognizing in his flustered persistence the coaching of some well-meaning friend or relation who had assured him that Lady Aurelia Wyndham would be grateful for any gentleman's attention. "I am quite content where I am, I assure you." Baron Whitmore glanced around the alcove, as though searching for some explanation for her refusal that did not require him to accept simple rejection. His eyes landed again on Quill's basket, where the small terrier had begun to stir, disturbed perhaps by the unfamiliar masculine voice. "Is that a dog?" he asked, his tone caught between curiosity and concern. "Yes. His name is Quill." "You've brought a dog to a ball." It was not quite a question, more in statement of baffled fact, as though he were trying to reconcile the evidence before him with any reasonable explanation. "I have, yes." The Baron's expression shifted through several variations of confusion before settling on something that might have been charitable concern. "Lady Aurelia, forgive my directness, but surely the creature would be more comfortable at home. The noise and crowds of such an event can hardly be pleasant for an animal, and I cannot imagine, that is, it seems rather—" He stopped, visibly struggling for diplomatic phrasing. "Rather eccentric?" Aurelia supplied quietly. "Rather unsuitable for a lady of breeding? Rather indicative of a peculiar and possibly unstable temperament?" "I would not have put it in such terms." "No, but others have, and with far less delicacy." She looked down at Quill, who had lifted his small head and was regarding the Baron with the mild interest of a creature accustomed to being discussed. "He requires constant supervision, Baron Whitmore. Leaving him at home, is not a possibility I am willing to entertain." The Baron's face took on the expression of a man attempting to solve a complex mathematical problem. Surely a trusted servant could. No. The single word fell between them with the weight of absolute finality, and Aurelia watched as understanding began to dawn in the Baron's eyes. This was not a whim or an affectation. This was not some romantic notion of fashionable eccentricity that might be gently discouraged or reasoned away. This was an immovable fact of her existence, as much a part of her as the color of her eyes or the cadence of her speech. "I see," he said slowly. "That is to say, I begin to understand that you are that the animal is—" He cleared his throat. "Lady Aurelia, I hope you will not think me impertinent, but I must speak plainly. I am seeking a wife, a partner to help manage my household and provide guidance to my children. Such a role would require considerable time and attention, social obligations, travel between my various properties. It would be, I fear, entirely incompatible with the degree of—" He gestured helplessly at Quill's basket. "The degree of devotion I have already committed elsewhere," Aurelia finished for him. "Yes, Baron Whitmore, I quite agree." He blinked, surprised by her directness. "Then you understand that any connection between us would be impossible." "Yes, I understand perfectly." She met his gaze steadily, allowing him to see that she harbored no illusions, nursed no secret hopes that he might be different from all the others. "You require a wife who can devote herself entirely to your household and your children. I require a life that accommodates Quill's needs above all else. These requirements are mutually exclusive." For a moment, the Baron seemed inclined to argue, perhaps to suggest some compromise that would allow him to report to whoever had encouraged this approach that he had made a valiant effort. But something in Aurelia's expression must have conveyed the futility of such an attempt, because instead he simply nodded, the gesture heavy with a resignation that might have been tinged with relief. "I see. Well, I am sorry we could not, that circumstances do not allow." He bowed stiffly. "I wish you well, Lady Aurelia. Truly. And you, Baron Whitmore. I hope you find a lady who can give you and your children all that you deserve." He retreated across the ballroom with considerably more haste than he had approached, and Aurelia watched him go with the numb detachment of a soldier who has survived yet another skirmish in a war she knows she cannot win. Within minutes, she observed him in conversation with Miss Elizabeth Crane, a sensible young woman of 22, with a reputation for excellent household management and a pleasant disposition. Miss Crane smiled at whatever the Baron said and accepted his invitation to dance with flattering alacrity. That is how it should be, Aurelia thought. That is what a normal courtship looks like, when both parties are free to pursue their futures, unburdened by unconventional devotions and impossible choices. In his basket, Quill had settled back into sleep, his small rib cage rising and falling with peaceful regularity. Utterly unaware of the future his existence had just foreclosed, Aurelia reached down to adjust his blanket, her fingers lingering on the soft warmth of his fur, and felt the treacherous burning behind her eyes that seemed always to be waiting these days, ready to ambush her in moments of weakness. She had made her choice long ago, on that terrible night when his small body had convulsed in her arms and she had thought she might lose him. She had chosen his life over her own prospects, his comfort over her own happiness. And she would make that same choice again and again, no matter how many Baron Whitmores approached and retreated, no matter how many glittering futures dissolved before her, like morning frost in sunlight. "It is worth it," she whispered to Quill, to herself, to the empty air of her alcove. "You are worth it." But as she lifted her gaze to the brilliant ballroom beyond her small sanctuary, watching the dancers whirl past in their perfect, unencumbered joy, she could not quite silence the small, treacherous voice that wondered what it might be like to want something, someone, as much as she wanted to keep this small creature safe, to feel her heart race with possibility rather than merely with the constant, gnawing fear of loss. The thought was disloyal, and she pushed it away firmly, settling deeper into her chair and arranging her skirts as the musicians struck up the next set. She had her duty and her love, and the certainty that she was doing what was right, even if it meant spending the rest of her life in alcoves and corners, watching other people's happiness from a distance that could not be crossed. It would have to be enough. The evening had settled into its predictable rhythm. The swirl of dancers, the hum of conversation punctuated by laughter, the steady procession of servants bearing trays of champagne and delicate confections. When Aurelia first became aware of the attention, it was not the usual stolen glances or whispered commentary that followed her presence at such gatherings, but something altogether different. Something focused and intent. She felt it like a weight against her skin, and when she finally lifted her gaze from Quill's basket, she found its source immediately. Across the ballroom, standing in conversation with Lord Pemberton and two other gentlemen she did not recognize, was a man who could only be the Duke of Ashworth. Even at a distance, he commanded attention with an ease that seemed entirely unconscious. Tall and lean, with dark hair that wanted cutting and eyes that even from across the crowded room appeared unusually light, almost gray. He was dressed with impeccable formality in black evening clothes that somehow emphasized, rather than concealed, a frame more suited to a man of action than a drawing room. And there was something in the way he held himself that suggested he was merely tolerating the glittering assembly around him, rather than enjoying it. And he was staring directly at her, not with the amused condescension she had learned to expect, nor with the pitying curiosity that so often accompanied observations of poor Lady Aurelia and her peculiar companion. This was something else entirely. A sharp, assessing interest that made her breath catch in her throat and her pulse quicken with an emotion she could not immediately name. She looked away quickly, heat rising to her cheeks, and occupied herself with checking Quill's water bowl, though it needed no checking. Perhaps she had been mistaken. Perhaps he had been looking at something beyond her, or through her, or, "His Grace seems quite intrigued by your little corner." Aurelia started at the voice. Mrs. Alderton, one of the more kindly matrons of her acquaintance, had appeared beside her alcove with a cup of punch and an expression of mild speculation. "I'm sure His Grace has far more interesting matters to occupy his attention," Aurelia said, keeping her voice carefully neutral. "One would think so. Yet he has been watching you for the better part of 20 minutes. Mrs. Alderton settled onto the nearby window seat with a rustle of bronze silk. "How very curious. I had heard he was a peculiar man, spent 5 years traveling in the East, studying obscure languages and ancient manuscripts, of all things. Returned only last month to assume his duties after his uncle's death. Society has been in quite a flutter about him." "I'm sure they have." Aurelia risked another glance across the ballroom and immediately regretted it. The Duke had concluded his conversation and was now moving through the crowd with unmistakable purpose, his path bringing him steadily closer to her alcove. "Mrs. Alderton, I believe I should check on, that is, I think perhaps I ought to." "Too late for retreat, my dear," Mrs. Alderton murmured, her eyes bright with interest. "He's coming this way." Indeed he was. The Duke of Ashworth crossed the ballroom floor with the same unconscious command he had displayed while standing still. And Aurelia watched with a mounting sense of unreality as he passed directly by Miss Hartwick, who had positioned herself strategically near the refreshment table, ignored entirely the flutter of fans and hopeful smiles from the cluster of young ladies arranged artfully near the orchestra, and continued his approach without hesitation or deviation. He was coming to her alcove, to her. Aurelia rose hastily, her hands instinctively smoothing her skirts, her heart hammering against her ribs with a force that seemed absurdly disproportionate to the situation. He was merely being polite, surely. Perhaps he made a habit of greeting all his guests personally, even those relegated to the margins of his ballroom. But when he finally stood before her, executing a bow of perfect formality, she saw in his eyes that same sharp interest she had observed from across the room, and she understood with sudden, disconcerting clarity that this was no mere social courtesy. "Lady Aurelia Wyndham," he said, and his voice was not at all what she had expected, deeper than his lean frame suggested, with a slight roughness that hinted at years spent in climates far from England's gentle damp. "I am Edmund Shaw. I hope you will forgive my approaching you without proper introduction, but I find myself disinclined to wait upon formality this evening." "Your Grace?" Aurelia sank into a curtsy, her mind racing. "You honor me with your attention." "Do I?" Something that might have been amusement flickered in those pale eyes. "I rather thought I was indulging my own curiosity." He glanced briefly at Quill's basket, then returned his gaze to her face with an intensity that made her want to look away. "You have been sitting in this corner for the entirety of the evening, watching the festivities as though you were studying some foreign ritual. I confess, I find myself wondering why." The directness of the question caught her off guard. "I am not much for dancing, Your Grace." "Not much for dancing, or not much invited to dance?" He tilted his head slightly, the gesture oddly reminiscent of a bird of prey considering its quarry. "There is a distinction, I think." "Perhaps both," she admitted, surprised by her own honesty. "How refreshing. A lady who does not dissemble." He smiled then, a quick flash of genuine amusement that transformed his severe features into something almost handsome. "I have spent the last hour enduring conversation with no fewer than 7 young ladies who assured me with breathless sincerity that they find obscure Sumerian dialects absolutely fascinating, despite clearly having no notion of what Sumerian is, let alone where Sumer was located. Your candor is a welcome change." Before Aurelia could formulate a response to this extraordinary statement, the Duke glanced down at Quill's basket once more, and she braced herself for the inevitable comment, the polite confusion or barely concealed distaste that always followed when people noticed her constant companion. Instead, the Duke said, "A terrier, I think. They are loyal creatures, fierce despite their size." "Yes," Aurelia managed. "His name is Quill." "Quill." The Duke repeated the name as though testing its weight. "Well then, Lady Aurelia, now that we have been properly, if unconventionally, introduced, I wonder if you might honor me with the next dance." The request fell into the space between them, like a stone into still water, and Aurelia felt the ripple of it spread outward through the nearby guests. She was aware of Mrs. Alderton's sharp intake of breath, of the sudden hush that had fallen over the conversations nearest them, of the weight of dozens of eyes suddenly fixed upon her alcove. The Duke of Ashworth, the most eligible gentleman in 3 counties, the mysterious scholar duke who had just returned from years abroad, was asking her to dance. Her, Lady Aurelia Wyndham, the pariah with the dog. "Your Grace," she began, her voice emerging smaller than she intended, "I am honored by your invitation, but I must. That is, I cannot." "Cannot?" One dark eyebrow lifted. "Or will not?" "Both." The word came out more forcefully than she had intended, and she saw surprise flicker across his features. She drew a breath, steeling herself. This was the moment where he would retreat, where understanding or distaste or simple social calculation would assert itself, and he would murmur some polite excuse and withdraw, leaving her to her corner and her dog and the whispers that would follow his failed attempt at charity. But the Duke did not retreat. Instead, he took a step closer, bringing him nearly to the edge of her alcove, close enough that she could see the faint lines at the corners of his eyes that suggested he smiled more often than his severe expression indicated, could catch the scent of sandalwood and something else. Something exotic that spoke of distant places and different customs. Both, he repeated softly. And there was something in his voice that had not been there before. Not amusement, precisely, but a kind of focused attention that made her feel as though she were the only person in the entire crowded ballroom. Now that, Lady Aurelia, is a response that demands explanation. Would you do me the very great honor of telling me why the most interesting woman in this entire tedious assembly refuses to dance with me? And despite everything, despite the watching crowd and her painful awareness of her own absurdity and the certain knowledge that this conversation could only end in humiliation, Aurelia felt something shift in her chest, some small, fragile thing unfurling like a leaf toward unexpected sunlight. Because, she said quietly, meeting his pale gaze directly, I cannot leave Quill. Not even for a dance. Not even for a duke. The words hung between them in the crystalline air of the ballroom, stark and unadorned, and Aurelia watched the duke's expression shift as he absorbed the full weight of what she had said. Not even for a duke. She had actually spoken those words aloud, had placed her devotion to a small terrier above the honor of dancing with the most sought-after gentleman in the room. And now there was nothing to do but wait for the inevitable withdrawal, the cooling of interest, the polite excuse that would end this bewildering interlude. But the Duke did not withdraw. His pale eyes remained fixed on her face with that same unsettling intensity. And after a moment that seemed to stretch into something far longer than it could possibly have been, he said simply, "Why? I beg your pardon? Why can you not leave him?" The Duke gestured to Quill's basket with one long-fingered hand. Even for the duration of a single dance? Surely the creature would survive a quarter hour without your immediate presence. It was the question everyone asked, in one form or another, and Aurelia had learned a dozen different ways to deflect it, to offer vague explanations about attachment and preference that satisfied curiosity without revealing the truth. But there was something in the Duke's gaze that stripped away her practiced evasions. Something that suggested he would know immediately if she offered him anything less than honesty. "He is not well," she heard herself say, and was startled by the rawness in her own voice. "That is, he suffers from a condition that requires constant vigilance. I must be near him, Your Grace, because if I am not, and something should happen—" She stopped, unable to continue, her throat suddenly tight with the familiar fear that lived beneath every moment of every day. What manner of condition? Aurelia glanced down at Quill, who remained peacefully asleep in his basket, blissfully unaware that his existence was being discussed by a duke. "He has seizures. They come without warning, and when they do, he requires immediate assistance, or he could—" She could not bring herself to complete the sentence. "I am the only one who knows precisely what must be done. I cannot risk being too far away when he needs me." The Duke was silent for a long moment, and Aurelia steeled herself for the response she had received from others when she had been foolish enough to explain the barely concealed pity, the awkward assurances that surely she was being overly cautious, the subtle suggestions that perhaps her attachment had grown unhealthy, obsessive even. Instead, the Duke said quietly, "How long has he suffered from this affliction?" 2 years, since he was barely a year old. And in those 2 years, you have remained constantly at his side? As much as is possible, yes. She lifted her chin slightly, defensive now. I know how it must appear to you, Your Grace. I am aware that society finds my devotion excessive, even ridiculous. But I will not, prioritize social expectations over his safety. If that makes me unsuitable for polite company, then so be it. Unsuitable. The Duke repeated the word as though tasting it, finding it curious. Is that what you believe yourself to be? It is what I have been told I am, repeatedly and with great clarity. The bitterness in her voice surprised her, and she softened her tone with effort. Lady Isabella Thorne was kind enough to explain to me, not an hour ago, that I have made myself a figure of ridicule, that I am sacrificing any hope of a respectable future for what she termed a pet obsession. Ah, yes, Lady Thorne. Something flickered across the Duke's features that might have been distaste. I had the dubious pleasure of making her acquaintance earlier this evening. She expressed great interest in my travels to Constantinople and assured me she had always been fascinated by Ottoman architecture, despite pronouncing Constantinople with 3 syllables and appearing uncertain as to whether the Ottomans were a people or a style of furniture. He paused. I confess, Lady Aurelia, I find her judgment on matters of suitability less than compelling. Despite everything, Aurelia felt a small, startled laugh escape her. Your Grace, you should not say such things. Should I not? Why? Because she is a viscountess and therefore beyond criticism? Or because I am expected to smile and nod while people perform elaborate pretenses of erudition in order to secure my favor? He shook his head. I spent 5 years in places where such social theater would be considered not merely tedious, but actively offensive to the principles of honest discourse. I find I have little patience for it now. Before Aurelia could formulate a response to this extraordinary statement, the Duke did something even more extraordinary. He looked around the alcove with the air of a man assessing available resources, located a small gilt chair positioned against the wall, and dragged it directly beside her settee with complete disregard for the watching crowd. Then, with the same decisive grace he had displayed in crossing the ballroom, he sat down. The gesture sent a visible ripple of shock through the nearby guests. A duke did not abandon the center of his own ball to sit in an alcove with an unwanted wallflower. A duke did not ignore the eager young ladies who had positioned themselves strategically throughout the room in hopes of securing his attention. And a duke most certainly did not arrange himself comfortably in a chair clearly intended to be decorative rather than functional and settle in as though he had no intention of moving for some considerable time. Yet the Duke of Ashworth had done precisely all of these things, and now sat not 2 feet from Aurelia, close enough that she could see the way his evening coat pulled slightly across his shoulders, suggesting a frame accustomed to more active pursuits than ballroom dancing. Close enough that when he turned to look at her, she could see flecks of darker gray in his pale eyes, like storm clouds gathering. Your Grace, she managed, acutely aware of the dozens of eyes fixed upon them. You cannot mean to, that is, surely you have other guests who require your attention. Undoubtedly. He stretched his long legs out before him with the air of a man settling in for an extended conversation. However, I find myself far more interested in learning about your situation than in enduring another round of insipid pleasantries with people who mistake flattery for conversation. But people will talk, Aurelia protested weakly. People are already talking. Have been since the moment I crossed the room to speak with you. He glanced at her, one corner of his mouth lifting slightly. I suspect that ship has sailed, as it were. We might as well give them something genuinely interesting to discuss. Aurelia found herself at a complete loss for words. This was so far beyond the bounds of anything she had imagined might happen this evening that she could not seem to organize her thoughts into any coherent response. The Duke of Ashworth was sitting beside her, in her alcove, apparently by choice, and showed no signs whatsoever of moving. Tell me about him, the Duke said, nodding toward Quill's basket. How did you come to have him? He was a gift from my brother, Aurelia said slowly, still half convinced this entire conversation was some elaborate dream from which she would shortly wake. For my 22nd birthday. Charles thought I needed companionship, something to occupy my time. She smiled slightly at the memory. I do not think he anticipated quite how thoroughly Quill would occupy my time. And when did you first notice the seizures? Not until he was nearly a year old. It was, her voice caught, remembering that terrible night. It was the most frightening thing I have ever experienced. I thought I was losing him. The physician my brother summoned said there was nothing to be done, that such afflictions in animals were unpredictable and often fatal, and that I should prepare myself for the worst. But you did not accept that prognosis. No. She looked down at Quill, sleeping peacefully in his nest of blankets, and felt the familiar fierce protectiveness surge through her. I refused to simply wait for him to die. I consulted every veterinary surgeon within 50 miles, read every text I could find on animal physiology, learned to recognize the warning signs so I could be ready when the episodes came. She lifted her gaze to meet the Duke's. I made him my entire world, Your Grace, because the alternative was unthinkable. The Duke studied her face for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he said quietly, and in doing so, you made yourself unmarriageable. It was not a question, and Aurelia did not pretend to misunderstand. Yes, you chose his life over your own prospects. I chose love over loneliness, disguised as respectability. The words emerged with a fierceness that surprised her. I chose loyalty over the approval of people who value appearances more than substance. And I would make the same choice again, Your Grace, every day for the rest of my life. The Duke leaned back in his chair, still watching her with that penetrating gaze, and Aurelia braced herself for judgment, for the inevitable moment when he would recognize the truth of what Isabella had said. That she was indeed pitiable, obsessed, fundamentally unsuitable for the sort of life a man of his position would require. Instead, Edmund Shaw, Duke of Ashworth, smiled, a real smile this time, slow and genuine and utterly transformative. Lady Aurelia Wyndham, he said softly, I believe you may be the first genuinely interesting person I have met since returning to England. The confession hung in the air between them, and Aurelia felt heat rise to her cheeks as she realized what she had just revealed. She had spoken to the Duke of Ashworth with a candor she rarely permitted herself even with her own family, had laid bare the choice that had defined the last 2 years of her existence, and now sat waiting for his response, with her heart beating an erratic rhythm against her ribs. Interesting, the Duke repeated, as though testing the adequacy of the word. Though perhaps that is insufficient. Remarkable might be closer to the mark. He leaned forward slightly, his elbows resting on his knees in a posture that would have made any proper matron gasp with horror at its informality. Do you know what I observed during my years abroad, Lady Aurelia? I saw entire cultures built upon principles of loyalty and honor, that would seem impossibly rigid to English society. Men who would sooner die than break their word. Women who devoted their lives to causes that brought them no material advantage whatsoever. He paused, his pale eyes holding hers. And I learned that such devotion, far from being weakness or obsession, is perhaps the truest measure of character. Society does not share your view, Aurelia said quietly. Society, in my experience, is largely composed of people performing elaborate pantomimes of respectability, while harboring the most spectacular hypocrisies. His voice carried an edge of something that might have been bitterness. I have spent the last month being paraded before every eligible young lady in the county, each one assuring me of her impeccable breeding and suitable accomplishments. And not one of them has displayed a fraction of the genuine conviction you have shown in refusing to dance with me. Despite herself, Aurelia felt a smile tug at the corner of her mouth. I suspect most young ladies would consider refusing a duke to be the height of foolishness rather than conviction. Most young ladies would be wrong. He shifted in his chair, angling himself more directly toward her. Tell me something, Lady Aurelia. If circumstances were different, if Quill did not require your constant presence, would you enjoy dancing? The question caught her off guard, pulling at something she had buried so deeply she had almost forgotten it existed. She stopped, swallowing against the unexpected tightness in her throat. I used to love it. Before. When I was younger and still believed that such pleasures were meant for me. And now? Now I watch others dance and tell myself that I have made the worthier choice. That their joy is ephemeral, while my purpose is constant. She looked down at her hands, folded tightly in her lap. Most of the time, I even believe it. But not always. No. The admission cost her more than she had anticipated. Not always. Sometimes, when the music is particularly beautiful, or when I see a couple who seem genuinely happy in each other's company, I feel... She stopped, unable to continue. Longing, the Duke supplied softly. You feel the loss of what you have sacrificed, even knowing you would make the same sacrifice again. Aurelia lifted her gaze to his face, startled by the understanding in his voice. Yes, exactly that. How did you? Because I have felt something similar. He leaned back again, his eyes drifting toward the crowded ballroom beyond their alcove. When I left England, I did so with a great sense of purpose. I would study the ancient world, master languages that were dying, preserve knowledge that might otherwise be lost to time. Noble work, certainly. Meaningful work. His mouth twisted slightly. And yet, there were moments, standing in some remote monastery, transcribing manuscripts by candlelight while the wind howled outside, when I wondered what I had given up for that purpose. What ordinary joys I might have experienced had I chosen a more conventional path. But you do not regret your choice? No, as you do not regret yours. He turned back to her, and something in his expression had softened. We are alike in this, I think. We have both chosen paths that society deems eccentric at best, unsuitable at worst, and we have both learned to bear the weight of that choice, even when it grows heavy. They sat in silence for a moment, the noise of the ballroom seeming to recede until Aurelia was aware only of the Duke's presence beside her. The unexpected kinship that had formed between them in the space of a single conversation. It was perhaps the most intimate exchange she had ever had with anyone outside her immediate family. And the realization brought with it a sharp pang of something that felt dangerously close to hope. May I ask you something, Lady Aurelia? The Duke's voice had grown even quieter, requiring her to lean slightly closer to hear him over the music. If you could have anything, if circumstances were somehow different and you could wish for something without limitation, what would it be? The question was so unexpected, so earnestly asked, that Aurelia found herself answering before she could think better of it. "I would wish to dance," she said, and felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes, even as she spoke. "Just once. I would wish to move across a ballroom floor without fear, without having to calculate how far I was from Quill, or whether he might need me. I would wish to experience that joy, that simple, uncomplicated pleasure, without having to choose between it and my duty to him." She pressed her lips together, fighting for composure. "I know how foolish that sounds, how impossibly childish, to wish for something so. It is not foolish." The Duke's voice had taken on a quality she could not quite identify, something fierce and almost tender. "It is not foolish at all." Aurelia wiped quickly at her eyes, mortified that she had allowed herself to become so emotional in front of a virtual stranger, even one who had shown her unexpected kindness. "Forgive me, Your Grace. I do not usually, that is, I am not generally given to such displays of, there is nothing to forgive." He was watching her with an intensity that made her breath catch. And when he spoke again, his words were slow and deliberate, as though he were working through some complex calculation in his mind. "What if I told you that your wish is not impossible? That there might be a way for you to dance without abandoning your responsibility to Quill? I would say that you are being kind, but that kindness does not alter reality." She attempted a smile, though she suspected it emerged as more of a grimace. "Unless you propose to clear the entire ballroom so that I might dance with Quill in my arms, I cannot imagine any scenario in which—" She stopped abruptly, because the Duke's expression had changed. Something had kindled in his pale eyes, a sudden spark of what looked absurdly like inspiration, and he was staring at her as though she had just solved a puzzle he had been attempting to work out. "Your Grace?" she ventured, unsettled by the transformation. "What is it?" But the Duke did not answer immediately. Instead, he rose from his chair with sudden decisiveness, the movement fluid and purposeful, and for a wild moment, Aurelia thought he might be preparing to leave, that she had somehow offended him with her tearful confession and her impossible wishes. Then he bowed to her, a formal, perfectly executed bow that seemed entirely at odds with the informal conversation they had just shared, and said, "Lady Aurelia, would you do me the very great honor of waiting here for approximately 10 minutes? There is something I must attend to, but I give you my word that I shall return." "I, of course, Your Grace. But I do not understand." "You will?" His smile was unlike anything she had seen on his face before, bright and almost boyish, with what appeared to be genuine delight. "I promise you, Lady Aurelia, you will understand very shortly." And with that cryptic assurance, the Duke of Ashworth strode away from her alcove, moving through the crowd with the same decisive purpose he had displayed in approaching it, leaving Aurelia staring after him in complete bewilderment. Beside her basket, Quill stirred and lifted his small head, blinking sleepily as though he too sensed that something significant had just occurred, though he could not possibly comprehend what. Aurelia reached down automatically to stroke his ears, her mind racing through the extraordinary conversation she had just experienced, trying to make sense of the Duke's abrupt departure and his promise to return. 10 minutes, he had said. She was to wait 10 minutes. Around her, the ballroom continued its glittering rotation, couples forming and dissolving like patterns in a kaleidoscope. And Aurelia sat in her alcove with her sleeping dog and her racing heart. wondering what on earth the Duke of Ashworth could possibly be planning, and why the very air seemed to have changed, charged now with a possibility she dared not name. The musicians struck up a new waltz, and the dancers swept onto the floor in a swirl of silk and candlelight. And Aurelia Wyndham, who had long ago accepted that such beauty was not meant for her, felt something unfurl in her chest that she had thought long dead. It felt dangerously, impossibly, like hope. The 10 minutes stretched into an eternity. Aurelia sat frozen in her alcove, acutely aware of the curious glances being cast her direction, of the whispered speculation that rippled through the nearby clusters of guests. Mrs. Alderton had departed some minutes ago with a meaningful look that suggested she would require a full accounting of the Duke's extraordinary behavior at the earliest opportunity. And now Aurelia was alone with Quill and her bewilderment, watching the ballroom entrance for the Duke's return and trying to calm the erratic beating of her heart. She told herself not to hope. Whatever the Duke intended, it could not possibly be what her foolish imagination had conjured in the wake of his departure. He was being kind, nothing more. Perhaps he had gone to arrange for some quieter space where she might sit more comfortably, or to speak with her mother about ensuring Quill's needs were accommodated. Perhaps he had simply been called away by some pressing ducal responsibility and would not return at all. And yet she could not forget the look in his eyes when she had spoken, thoughtlessly, desperately, about wishing to dance. The sudden kindling of something that had looked almost like determination. The current waltz was reaching its crescendo when she saw him. The Duke emerged from the corridor that led to his private apartments, moving with that same purposeful grace she was beginning to recognize as characteristic of him. And he was not alone. Behind him came what appeared to be his entire household staff. Footmen in their formal livery, the butler she recognized from her arrival, even several maids still wearing their working aprons. The Duke spoke briefly to his butler, who nodded once and then moved toward the orchestra with surprising speed for a man of his years and dignity. Within moments, the music faltered and stopped mid-phrase, leaving the dancers frozen in awkward poses across the ballroom floor. A confused murmur rose from the assembled guests. The Duke had taken a position near the center of the room, and now he raised one hand in a gesture that commanded immediate silence. Aurelia felt her breath stop entirely, some part of her understanding what was about to happen, even as her rational mind rejected it as impossible. "Ladies and gentlemen," the Duke said, his voice carrying effortlessly across the sudden hush, "I must beg your indulgence for a most irregular request. I find that I require the ballroom to be cleared for a brief period. My staff will be happy to direct you to the drawing rooms and parlors, where refreshments will be served and you may continue your conversations in comfort. I anticipate this interruption will last no more than a quarter hour." The murmur that followed this announcement was no longer confused, but shocked. Clear the ballroom? At the height of the Christmas Eve ball? Several guests began to voice protests, but the Duke's footmen were already moving through the crowd with polite but inexorable efficiency, gently shepherding people toward the various exits. Lady Isabella Thorne's voice rose above the general commotion. "Your Grace, surely this is some sort of jest? You cannot mean to actually—" "I assure you, Lady Thorne, I am entirely serious." The Duke's tone remained pleasant, but carried an edge of absolute authority. "My staff will see to your comfort while you wait. I do apologize for the inconvenience." Aurelia watched in stunned disbelief as the ballroom began to empty. Guests filed out in various states of confusion and indignation, their protests growing fainter as they were efficiently removed from the space. The musicians gathered their instruments and departed. The servants who had been circulating with refreshments retreated to their stations. Within minutes, the vast ballroom, which had been packed with easily 200 guests, stood empty save for the Duke, still positioned near its center, and Aurelia herself, still seated in her alcove with Quill's basket at her feet. The Duke dismissed his staff with a quiet word, and then even they withdrew, closing the great doors behind them with a soft click that seemed to echo in the sudden silence. And then there was nothing but the crackle of the fire in the hearth, the faint whisper of snow against the windows, and the Duke of Ashworth walking toward her across an entirely empty ballroom floor, his footsteps the only sound in the vast space. Aurelia could not move, could not breathe, could not do anything but stare at him as he approached, her mind struggling to comprehend what he had just done, what he was doing now. He stopped before her alcove and executed another one of those formal bows. And when he straightened, his pale eyes held hers with an intensity that made her feel as though the very air between them had become charged with something electric. "The floor is yours, Lady Aurelia," he said quietly. "And Quill's." "Your Grace, Her voice emerged as barely a whisper. You did not just clear my ballroom of 200 guests so that you might dance without fear or judgment?" One corner of his mouth lifted. "I assure you, I did precisely that." Aurelia felt tears spring to her eyes, hot and immediate, and she pressed one hand to her mouth to stifle the sound that wanted to escape, something between a laugh and a sob. "This is madness," she managed. "They will think you have lost your senses. They will talk about this for years." "Undoubtedly." He extended one hand toward her, palm up, an invitation and a promise. "But I find I care very little what they think, and a great deal about keeping a promise I made to the first genuine person I have encountered since returning to this peculiar island." "But why?" The question emerged as almost a plea. "Why would you do something so extraordinary for someone you met mere hours ago?" The Duke's expression softened into something that stole what little remained of her breath. "Because you told me your greatest wish, and I found that I could not bear the thought of you sitting in corners for the rest of your life, believing that joy and loyalty must be mutually exclusive." He kept his hand extended, steady and sure. "Because in the space of a single conversation, you showed me more courage and conviction than I have witnessed in a lifetime of social obligations." He paused, and his voice dropped to something barely above a whisper. "And because, when you spoke of your love for that small creature in his basket, I saw in your face the kind of devotion I have spent 5 years searching for in ancient texts and forgotten philosophies, never realizing I might find it in a ballroom alcove on Christmas Eve." Aurelia could not speak, could not think, could only stare at this impossible man who had just turned his entire world upside down for a wish she had never dared believe could be granted. "Lady Aurelia," the Duke said gently, "would you do me the very great honor of dancing with me? You and your brave companion both?" She looked down at Quill, who had woken and was watching the proceedings with his usual calm interest, as though Dukes cleared ballrooms for him on a regular basis. Then she looked back at Edmund Shaw, at his extended hand and his patient expression and the absolute certainty in his eyes that this was right, that this was good, that this moment was worth every bit of scandal it would undoubtedly create. And slowly, trembling, Aurelia stood. She gathered Quill from his basket, tucking him carefully into the crook of her left arm, and then, hardly believing she was doing this, that any of this was real, she placed her right hand in the Duke's. His fingers closed around hers, warm and sure, and he smiled at her with such open delight that she felt something inside her chest crack wide open, some wall she had built to protect herself from wanting things she could never have. "Come then," Edmund said softly, leading her toward the center of the vast, empty ballroom. Let us show them all what true devotion looks like when it is honored rather than scorned. And as he raised his hand to signal the orchestra, because of course he had arranged for the orchestra to remain, hidden somewhere beyond the doors, Aurelia Wyndham stepped into a waltz position with a duke who had moved heaven and earth for her. Her small dog cradled safely between them and felt her heart begin to believe in impossible things. The first notes of the waltz drifted into the empty ballroom from somewhere beyond the closed doors, the orchestra playing for an audience of 3, their music echoing in the vast space with a clarity and beauty that seemed almost otherworldly. Edmund's hand settled at Aurelia's waist with a gentleness that acknowledged the precious burden she carried. And then they were moving, sweeping across the polished floor in the timeless pattern of the dance. Aurelia had forgotten what it felt like. The music flowing through her body, the steady guidance of a skilled partner, the sensation of moving not as a solitary figure, but as half of something greater, something graceful and right. Edmund led with the same quiet confidence he had displayed in every interaction, his steps sure and unhurried, perfectly calibrated to accommodate both her inexperience and the small dog cradled between them. Quill, for his part, seemed utterly content with this strange arrangement. His dark eyes watched the movement around him with mild interest, and occasionally his tail wagged against Aurelia's arm, as though he approved of this new adventure. They danced past the great windows where snow continued to fall in soft, silent curtains, past the blazing hearth where firelight cast dancing shadows on the walls, past the empty alcove where Aurelia had spent so many evenings watching other people's happiness from a safe distance. "He is remarkably calm," Edmund observed, glancing down at Quill with what appeared to be genuine admiration. "I half expected him to object to being swept about a ballroom." "He trusts me," Aurelia said softly, and felt the truth of those words settle in her chest like a weight and a comfort both. "He knows I would never place him in danger. As you trust him, I think, to be worth the sacrifices you have made." She looked up at Edmund's face, at the pale eyes that watched her with such focused attention, and felt something shift in the space between them. "You understand?" she said, and it was not quite a question. "You truly understand why I could not abandon him, even for something as simple as a dance. I understand that love, true, unconditional love, does not calculate cost or weigh competing obligations." His hand tightened slightly at her waist, drawing her a fraction closer. "I understand that what you have shown this creature is not obsession or foolishness, but the rarest form of loyalty. The kind that endures even when it brings no advantage, no recognition, no reward beyond the knowledge that you have honored your commitment." The word struck something deep within her, and Aurelia felt tears threatening again, hot and insistent behind her eyes. "No one has ever," her voice broke, and she had to stop, had to breathe through the sudden tightness in her throat. "Everyone else sees only what I have given up, what I have lost. You are the first person who has looked at what I have chosen to keep." Edmund slowed their waltz slightly, his movements becoming even more deliberate, as though he wanted to stretch this moment into something that could be remembered in perfect detail. "Then everyone else is a fool," he said simply. "Because what you have kept, this fierce, unwavering devotion, is worth more than all the ballroom dances and social approval in England." They turned in a slow circle near the center of the room, and Aurelia became aware that the music had shifted into something even more tender, a melody she recognized from her childhood, when her father had danced with her in the drawing room at Wyndham House, and the future had seemed full of uncomplicated promise. The memory should have brought pain, but instead she felt only a bittersweet gratitude that she could still recall what joy felt like. That Edmund had given her this impossible gift of dancing without fear, without choice, without the terrible weight of abandoning what she loved most. "Would you like to try something?" Edmund asked. And at her questioning look, he nodded toward Quill. "Set him down. Let him walk beside us, if he wishes." Aurelia hesitated, her arms tightening instinctively around the small terrier. "But what if—" "I will watch him as carefully as you do," Edmund said quietly. "I promise you, if there is any sign of distress, we will stop immediately. But I think," he smiled slightly, "I think he might enjoy the freedom, and I would very much like to dance with you properly, just once, with both hands free to hold you." The intimacy of the suggestion made her breath catch, but she found herself nodding, trusting this man in a way that should have been impossible after so brief an acquaintance. Slowly, carefully, she bent and placed Quill on the polished floor. The terrier stood for a moment, apparently considering his options, and then, to Aurelia's astonishment, began to trot alongside them as they resumed the waltz, his small legs keeping pace with their measured steps, his tail wagging with what looked absurdly like pleasure. And then Edmund's other hand came to rest at her waist, and he drew her properly into waltz position. And they were dancing as she had always imagined it might be. Her hand in his arm around her, moving together across an empty ballroom with a small dog weaving happily around their feet and music that seemed to come from somewhere beyond the physical world. "There," Edmund murmured, and his voice was close to her ear now, warm and intimate in a way that sent shivers down her spine. "This is what it should be. Joy and duty together, not forced into opposition. Love that expands rather than diminishes. A life where you need not choose between devotion and happiness, because the right person, the right partnership, honors both." Aurelia looked up at him, at this extraordinary man who had cleared an entire ballroom for her, who watched her dog with the same careful attention she herself employed, who spoke of love and loyalty as though they were the most natural things in the world, rather than impossible luxuries she had long ago learned to live without. "Your Grace," she whispered, "I do not understand why you have done this, why you would take such a risk for someone like me." "Someone like you." Edmund's expression softened into something that made her heart stutter in her chest. "Lady Aurelia, I have traveled halfway around the world, seeking wisdom and truth. I have studied with scholars and mystics, read texts that most people do not even know exist, searched desperately for some deeper meaning to existence." He paused, and when he spoke again, his voice carried absolute conviction. "And in one evening, sitting in an alcove with a woman and her sick dog, I found more genuine truth than in 5 years of searching. You showed me what real courage looks like, what real love demands. And I found that I could not—" He stopped, seeming to search for words. "I could not bear to let you sit in that corner believing you were unsuitable when you are the most suitable person I have ever encountered." The music swelled around them, and they turned in another slow circle, Quill still trotting faithfully at their feet, and Aurelia felt the last of her carefully constructed walls crumble into dust. This was real. This impossible, extraordinary moment was actually happening, and the Duke of Ashworth was looking at her as though she were something precious rather than pitiable, something to be cherished rather than merely tolerated. "I would like to call upon you," Edmund said suddenly, the words emerging with an urgency that suggested he had not planned to speak them quite so soon. "Tomorrow, if you would permit it, or the day after, if you need time to think about what has happened tonight." but I find I cannot let you leave without knowing that I might see you again. That this is not merely one beautiful, impossible moment, but the beginning of something more. Aurelia's heart was beating so hard, she thought he must surely be able to feel it, must be able to sense the way her entire world had shifted on its axis in the space of a single waltz. "You wish to call upon me," she repeated, trying to make sense of the words. "Even knowing that Quill will always be present. Even knowing that I cannot, that I will not, compromise his care for any reason. Especially knowing that." Edmund's hand tightened on hers, his pale eyes holding her gaze with fierce intensity. "Lady Aurelia, I am not asking you to change or to compromise or to become someone more conventionally suitable. I am asking if I might have the honor of knowing you better, exactly as you are, with all your fierce loyalty and impossible devotion. I am asking if you would allow me to be part of a life that includes both you and the small creature who has your whole heart." Below them, as though in answer, Quill yipped once, a small happy sound, and sat down directly between their feet, forcing them to stop dancing. Edmund laughed, a genuine, delighted sound, and looked down at the terrier with obvious fondness. "I believe," he said, still smiling, "that he has just given his approval." And Aurelia, standing in the center of an empty ballroom with a duke who had moved heaven and earth for her and a small dog who trusted her completely, felt joy bloom in her chest like spring flowers breaking through winter snow. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, you may call upon me. Tomorrow, if you wish. And the day after. And," her voice broke with emotion, "and for as many days as you continue to understand that we are a pair, Quill and I. That you cannot have one without the other." "I would not want it any other way," Edmund said softly, and bent to scoop Quill up with one hand while keeping the other clasped firmly around Aurelia's. "Shall we try once more? One final waltz with all three of us, before I must return you to the world and face the consequences of my spectacular breach of protocol?" And as the music began again, Aurelia Wyndham danced with the Duke of Ashworth and her beloved dog, and knew that her life had just transformed into something she had never dared imagine possible. A future where love did not require sacrifice, where devotion was honored rather than scorned, and where the very quality that had made her unmarriageable had somehow become the key to her happiness. The week between Christmas and New Year's Eve passed in a blur of impossible moments that felt more like fever dreams than reality. Edmund called upon her the very next day, appearing at Wyndham House in the early afternoon with muddy boots and a complete disregard for proper visiting hours, suggesting a walk through the winter fields despite the threatening sky and the shocked protests of Aurelia's mother. They had walked for 2 hours, Quill racing ahead on his lead and then circling back to check on them with endearing regularity, while Edmund spoke of his travels and asked endless questions about her management of Quill's condition with the focused attention of a scholar approaching a worthy subject. The day after, he arrived even earlier, this time with a small leather journal he had commissioned from a bookbinder in the village. "Pages already ruled and dated," he explained, so that she might keep more systematic records of Quill's episodes and perhaps identify patterns she had not yet noticed. The thoughtfulness of the gesture had left her speechless, and she had clutched the journal to her chest while Quill investigated Edmund's boots with thorough approval. By the 3rd day, Edmund had stopped bothering with the formality of the drawing room entirely, instead meeting her at the garden gate and leading her on increasingly adventurous rambles across the countryside, Quill trotting between them like a small, devoted chaperone. They walked through frost-rimed fields and along frozen streams, their conversation ranging from the profound to the ridiculous. and Aurelia found herself laughing more in those few days than she had in the previous 2 years combined. Society, predictably, was scandalized. The whispers that had followed the Christmas Eve ball, when 200 guests had been summarily dismissed so that the Duke might dance with Lady Aurelia and her dog, had grown into a full chorus of shocked speculation. Lady Isabella Thorne had apparently declared the entire affair proof of the Duke's foreign eccentricities and predicted that the infatuation would fade once he came to his senses. Mrs. Pemberton had expressed sympathy for poor Lady Aurelia, who was clearly being set up for a spectacular heartbreak. Even well-meaning friends had cautioned her mother that the Duke's attentions, while flattering, could not possibly lead to anything respectable. But Edmund showed no signs of coming to his senses or losing interest. If anything, his fascination seemed to deepen with each encounter, and Aurelia watched with growing wonder as he learned to read Quill's signals almost as well as she did. Noting when the small dog grew tired or anxious, adjusting their pace and activities accordingly without being asked. On New Year's Eve, Edmund sent a note requesting permission to call upon her that evening, despite the fact that the Wyndhams were hosting a small gathering of family and close friends to mark the occasion. He arrived precisely at 8 o'clock, was polite and charming to her relatives for exactly the duration required by courtesy, and then asked if he might speak with Aurelia privately in the library. Her mother's eyebrows had risen nearly to her hairline, but she had given her consent with a knowing look that made Aurelia's cheeks flame. They retreated to the library, Aurelia, Edmund, and Quill, who seemed to consider himself an essential part of any conversation. And Edmund closed the door behind them with a soft click that seemed unnaturally loud in the book-lined silence. For a long moment, he simply stood looking at her, his pale eyes reflecting the firelight, and Aurelia felt her heart begin to race with something that felt like anticipation and terror in equal measure. "I have been thinking," Edmund said finally, moving to stand before the fire, "about the nature of courtship, the proper sequence of events, the timeline that society deems appropriate for such things. Your Grace, Edmund." He turned to face her fully. "I think we have moved rather beyond formality. Do you not agree?" "Edmund," she amended, her voice barely above a whisper. "What are you saying?" "I am saying that I have known you for exactly 1 week. That by all conventional standards, this is a preposterously insufficient period upon which to base any permanent decision." He took a step toward her, his expression intense. "And I am also saying that I have never been less interested in conventional standards than I am at this moment." Aurelia's hands had begun to tremble, and she clasped them tightly together to still them. Quill, sensing her agitation, moved to sit directly on her feet, his small body warm and grounding. "In the past week," Edmund continued, his voice growing softer but no less intense, "I have watched you navigate frozen streams while carrying a dog who refused to get his paws wet. I have seen you drop to your knees in the mud when you thought Quill might be showing signs of distress, completely indifferent to your ruined dress. I have observed you explain his condition to my head groom with the precision of a medical lecturer and the passion of a poet." He paused, and something flickered across his features that might have been awe. "And I have come to understand that what I witnessed in that ballroom alcove was not an anomaly, but the truest expression of who you are. A woman whose capacity for love is so vast, so unwavering, that she has reshaped her entire life around protecting something vulnerable. Edmund, I do not understand what you are. I am asking you to marry me." The words emerged with sudden, fierce clarity, and Aurelia felt the world tilt beneath her feet. I am asking you to bring your fierce loyalty and your impossible devotion and your small, tyrannical dog into my life permanently. I am asking if you would consent to be my Duchess, with the absolute understanding that Quill will be as much a part of our household as either of us, that his needs will be honored and accommodated, and that I will never, ever ask you to choose between duty and love, because they are the same thing. Aurelia could not breathe, could not think, could only stare at this extraordinary man who was offering her something she had genuinely believed impossible, a future that did not require her to sacrifice any part of herself or her devotion. "You cannot mean this," she heard herself say. "You are a duke. You need an heir, a hostess, someone who can manage your estates and navigate society without bringing a dog to every function and spending half her time worrying about seizures and—" "I need a partner," Edmund interrupted firmly. "Someone genuine and brave and utterly incapable of pretense. Someone who understands that true worth is measured not in social graces, but in the courage to love completely, even when that love brings cost." He closed the distance between them, taking her trembling hands in his. "Aurelia, in you, I have found something I did not know existed. A heart so fierce and true that it makes everything else, titles, expectations, society's approval, seem trivial by comparison. But I am not what a duchess should be," she whispered. "I am peculiar and obsessed, and I will embarrass you. You will never embarrass me." His grip on her hands tightened. "You will challenge me and surprise me, and probably drag me through countless muddy fields in pursuit of Quill's exercise requirements. But embarrass me? Never. Because there is no shame in loving deeply, Aurelia. There is only grace." She looked down at Quill, who was watching the proceedings with his usual calm interest, and then back up at Edmund's face, at the absolute certainty she saw there, and felt something inside her, finally, fully believe that this was real. "Yes," she breathed, and then louder, more certain. "Yes, yes, I will marry you." The smile that broke across Edmund's face was incandescent, transforming his austere features into something radiant. He lifted her hands to his lips, pressing a kiss to her knuckles that sent warmth flooding through her entire body. And then, with obvious care not to disturb Quill, he drew her into his arms. "I promise you," he murmured against her hair, "that I will spend every day proving that you made the right choice. That devotion is not a flaw to be overcome, but a strength to be celebrated. That the love you have shown this small creature is the very quality that makes you extraordinary." Aurelia pressed her face against his chest, breathing in the scent of wool and sandalwood and winter air, and felt tears of joy stream down her cheeks. Below them, Quill yipped once, a sound of approval, and Edmund laughed, the vibration of it rumbling through his chest. "I believe," Aurelia said, her voice muffled against his coat, "that he is granting his blessing." "Then we have all we need," Edmund replied. "You, me, and one very opinionated terrier. The rest, titles, estates, society's judgment, we shall navigate together." And as the clock in the hallway chimed midnight, marking the arrival of a new year, Aurelia Wyndham stood in her family's library in the arms of the Duke of Ashworth, her small dog pressed between them, and knew that her life had transformed into something more beautiful than any story she had dared imagine. The announcement appeared in the Times on the 2nd of January, 1819, and sent shockwaves through London society that reverberated all the way to the remotest country estates. The Duke of Ashworth, one of the most eligible gentlemen in England, was to wed Lady Aurelia Wyndham the eccentric wallflower who brought her dog to balls, in a ceremony to be held on Valentine's Day at the Duke's private chapel at Ashworth Manor. The speculation was immediate and merciless. Lady Isabella Thorne declared it proof that foreign travel had addled the Duke's wits beyond repair. Mrs. Pemberton expressed tearful sympathy for Aurelia's poor mother, who would surely be mortified when the engagement inevitably collapsed. Even those who wished the couple well could not quite suppress their shock at the unconventional match. But Edmund remained utterly unmoved by society's censure. When the Countess of Hartwick ventured to suggest, delicately, at a dinner party, that perhaps the Duke's intended might be encouraged to adopt a more conventional approach to pet ownership after the wedding, Edmund had fixed her with a look of such cold politeness that she had actually stammered mid-sentence. Lady Aurelia's devotion to Quill is not a flaw to be corrected, but a virtue I intend to support completely, he had said, his voice carrying to every corner of the suddenly silent dining room. Any member of society who cannot comprehend that distinction is welcome to decline their invitation to our wedding. The Countess had not raised the subject again, and word of the Duke's fierce defense of his intended had spread through the ton with gratifying speed. The whispers did not cease entirely, but they grew more cautious, and Aurelia noticed that the pitying glances she had endured for so long had transformed into something closer to bewildered respect. The weeks leading to the wedding passed in a flurry of preparations that Edmund insisted be tailored entirely to Aurelia's comfort, rather than society's expectations. When the modiste suggested that Aurelia might need to leave Quill at home for the lengthy fittings, Edmund had the woman come to Wyndham House instead, where Quill could rest comfortably nearby. When the vicar expressed concern about having an animal present during the ceremony, Edmund calmly informed him that Quill was family and would be accommodated or they would find another officiant. Through it all, Aurelia watched with growing wonder as the man she was to marry demonstrated again and again that his promise to honor her devotion was not mere words, but absolute conviction. He commissioned a master craftsman to design a traveling basket for Quill with special cushioning and ventilation for their honeymoon journey. He consulted with veterinary surgeons from Edinburgh and London about the latest treatments for seizure disorders. He even arranged for one of the guest rooms at Ashworth Manor to be converted into a dedicated space for Quill's care, complete with soft flooring and temperature controls. "You are doing too much," Aurelia protested one afternoon in early February, as Edmund showed her the plans for yet another accommodation he had ordered. "Quill is just a dog, Edmund. He does not require. He is not just a dog to you," Edmund interrupted gently. "Therefore he is not just a dog to me. He is the creature who taught you the true meaning of loyalty. And for that alone, he deserves every consideration I can provide." Valentine's Day dawned cold and bright, with sunlight streaming through frost-etched windows and a dusting of fresh snow that made Ashworth Manor look like something from a fairy story. Aurelia stood in her dressing room, resplendent in ivory silk that her mother had tearfully declared the most beautiful gown she had ever seen, and watched as her maid placed the final pins in her elaborate coiffure. Quill sat on a velvet cushion nearby, wearing a small collar of green silk ribbon that matched the subtle embroidery on Aurelia's gown. He seemed to sense the importance of the occasion and had been on his best behavior all morning, accepting the ministrations of various servants with patient dignity. "Are you ready, my darling?" her mother asked, appearing in the doorway with tears already streaming down her face. "The guests have all assembled, and His Grace—" She stopped, pressing a handkerchief to her eyes. "Oh, Aurelia, he has done something extraordinary." The chapel at Ashworth Manor was small and ancient, with stone walls that had witnessed centuries of weddings and christenings and farewells. When Aurelia entered on her brother's arm, Quill trotting sedately at her side on his green silk lead, she saw that Edmund had filled the space with candles and winter roses. their scent mingling with the smell of beeswax and old stone. But what made her breath catch was not the flowers or the candlelight, or even the sight of Edmund waiting for her at the altar, magnificent in his formal attire. It was the small velvet cushion positioned directly between where she and Edmund would stand to exchange their vows. A cushion of deepest green, embroidered with Quill's name in silver thread, placed in the position of honor as though he were not merely a witness to their union, but an essential part of it. Edmund's eyes met hers as she moved down the aisle, and the love she saw there was so fierce and tender that she felt tears spring to her eyes. He had done this, had placed her beloved dog literally at the center of their wedding ceremony, making visible and honored what society had deemed shameful and excessive. The ceremony itself passed in a blur of sacred words and trembling hands, and the vicar's sonorous voice echoing in the ancient space. Aurelia heard herself make her vows with a clarity that surprised her, her voice steady and sure as she promised to love and honor this extraordinary man who had seen past society's judgments to the truth of who she was. And when Edmund slipped the ring onto her finger, his own voice was rough with emotion as he added words not in the traditional liturgy. I promise to honor not only you, but all that you hold dear. To see your devotion as the gift it is. To build a life where love expands rather than diminishes. Where loyalty is celebrated rather than scorned. At their feet, Quill settled onto his velvet cushion with a contented sigh, and a ripple of gentle laughter moved through the assembled guests, not mocking, but genuinely charmed by the small dog who had somehow become the unlikely architect of this union. When the vicar finally pronounced them husband and wife, Edmund drew Aurelia into his arms for a kiss that was both reverent and passionate, a promise and a celebration, and the chapel erupted in applause. But Aurelia was aware only of Edmund's lips on hers, his arms around her, and the warm weight of Quill pressing against their feet, all three of them bound together now, officially and irrevocably. The wedding breakfast was held in Ashworth Manor's great hall, and Aurelia watched in bemused delight as even Lady Isabella Thorne was forced to offer stiff congratulations, her expression suggesting she had bitten into something sour. But most of the guests were genuine in their well wishes, and Aurelia found herself surrounded by people who seemed, for perhaps the first time, to truly see her. Not as poor peculiar Lady Aurelia with her unfortunate obsession, but as the Duchess of Ashworth, wife to a man who had chosen her precisely because of, rather than despite, her fierce heart. As the afternoon faded into evening and guests began to depart for their own homes, Edmund drew Aurelia away to the library where he had proposed, Quill following faithfully at their heels. The fire had been lit against the winter chill, and someone had left champagne and delicate cakes on a side table. But Aurelia had eyes only for her husband. The word still felt strange and wonderful in her mind, who stood watching her with an expression of such complete contentment that it made her heart ache. "Are you happy?" he asked softly, drawing her into his arms. Aurelia thought of all the years she had spent in corners and alcoves, watching other people's joy from a distance, believing that her choice to love Quill unconditionally had closed the door on her own happiness forever. She thought of Lady Isabella's cruel words about sacrificing a future for a pet obsession, and Baron Whitmore's awkward retreat when he realized her devotion was non-negotiable. She thought of every pitying glance and whispered comment that had reinforced her certainty that she would spend her life alone. And then she looked at Edmund, this brilliant, eccentric man who had cleared an entire ballroom for her, who had designed velvet cushions and consulted veterinary surgeons and placed her dog at the center of their wedding ceremony, who had looked at her fierce, impossible love and seen not a flaw, but the truest measure of her character. "I am happier than I ever imagined possible," she whispered. and knew it for absolute truth. You have given me something I thought was lost forever, the ability to hope, to believe that devotion and joy need not be enemies. Edmund's arms tightened around her, and he pressed a kiss to her temple. You gave me something as well, you know. You showed me what I had been searching for in all those dusty manuscripts and ancient philosophies. The meaning of unconditional love, the beauty of unwavering loyalty, the courage it takes to choose what matters over what is easy. Below them, Quill yawned and settled onto the hearth rug with the satisfied air of a dog whose matchmaking duties were finally complete. And Aurelia, standing in her husband's arms in the library that had witnessed his proposal, realized the profound truth she had been too close to see. That her greatest love, the devotion that had made her a pariah, had always been the key to her truest happiness. She had not sacrificed her future for Quill. She had protected it, had held fast to her own heart in the face of society's demands, refusing to compromise what she knew to be right. And in doing so, she had become exactly the person Edmund had been waiting for, someone brave enough to love completely, regardless of cost. The fire crackled, and snow began to fall again outside the window. And the new Duchess of Ashworth stood with her eccentric duke and her faithful dog, and knew that she had found her place in the world at last. Not in spite of her unconventional devotion, but because of it. Not by changing who she was, but by remaining exactly herself until someone extraordinary enough to recognize her worth had finally arrived. And as Edmund led her toward the door and the future that awaited them, Quill trotting contentedly between them, Aurelia Wyndham Shaw understood that the truest fairy tales were not about transformation, but about recognition, about finding someone who saw you clearly and loved you completely, peculiarities and passions and impossible devotions and all. My sweet family, you just spent hours with Aurelia and Edmund's story. If their love was worth your time, isn't this channel worth one click? Subscribe so you never miss another story that makes you feel this much. At the end of this video, you'll see a suggestion for another powerful story from our channel. Click it and let yourself be surprised by even more unforgettable emotions with love. The Victorian Royal Stories team.